Okay, so like everyone knows that teenagers and math, right? It can be, it's not always a perfect match, you know?
Totally, totally. You hit the nail on the head there. Sometimes it clicks, sometimes it, well, doesn't.
Exactly. So what we're diving into today is like, what's the connection between how teenagers think about their own thinking and how they actually do in math, especially like those crucial years,
Yeah,
11 to 16.
right, those GCSE years,
Yeah.
when it really starts to matter.
Yeah, exactly. So think of this as a deep dive into like understanding how that self-awareness, that thinking about thinking impacts a teenager's ability to actually like crush it in math.
Yeah, like, does knowing how your brain works actually help you work those equations?
Precisely. And we're not just speculating here. We're basing this on some pretty solid research, right?
Yeah, we've got some serious academic firepower behind us today. We're talking about a meta-analysis, and this one was published in the Educational Psychology Review.
Oh, impressive. So meta-analysis, that means they like looked at a bunch of different studies, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
They didn't just look at one little study. They pulled together data from 31 different studies.
Wow. 31.
Yeah. And get this, it involved over 500,000 teenagers.
500,000. That's a lot of teenagers.
It's a huge sample size, which is why this meta-analysis is so valuable. It gives us a really broad and reliable look at this connection.
Okay, so why are we focusing on teenagers and their math skills? Isn't this like relevant for everyone?
Well, yeah, being good with numbers is definitely important throughout life, but adolescence is a really critical period.
How so?
Well, for one, it's when the math starts getting more complex. We're not just talking about adding and subtracting anymore. It's algebra, geometry, all that good
Oh
stuff.
yeah, the stuff that makes your head spin.
Right. And on top of that, you've got high-stakes exams like the GCSEs, which can have a big impact on their future options.
Yeah, that makes sense. So good math skills are kind of like a gateway to further education and good jobs.
Exactly. And it's not just about passing exams. It's about being able to use numbers in everyday life,
Yeah.
like managing your money, figuring out how long it'll take to get somewhere, even adjusting a recipe.
Oh yeah. I'm terrible at adjusting recipes.
Well, maybe some better metacognitive skills could help with that.
Metacognitive skills, there's that word again. So remind me, what exactly is metacognition?
So metacognition, it's basically the ability to think about your own thinking. It's being aware of your strengths and weaknesses as a learner, knowing what strategies work best for you, and being able to monitor and control your own learning process.
So it's like having an inner coach for your brain.
Exactly. It's like having that little voice in your head that says, hey, I'm not getting this. Maybe I should try a different approach, or, okay, I think I've got this concept down. Time to move on.
Oh, I see. So it's about like recognizing when you're confused and then being able to adjust what you're doing.
Yeah, and that ability becomes super important during adolescence as those math concepts get trickier and the pressure's on.
Makes sense. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of this research. What do they actually find about the relationship between metacognition and math performance in teenagers?
Okay, so the main takeaway is that there's a strong positive correlation between the two. This study found an overall correlation of R equals 0.37.
Okay, and for those of us who aren't statisticians, what does that mean?
Basically, it means that the more metacognitively aware a teenager is, the better they tend to perform in math. It's not a perfect relationship, but there's a clear trend.
So it's not a guarantee, but it's like a pretty good indicator, right? Like if you're good at thinking about your thinking, you're more likely to be good at math.
Right. But here's the thing. They didn't find that this relationship was exactly the same across all 31 studies they looked at.
So it wasn't like a uniform thing.
No, there was some variation, what they call heterogeneity in research.
Yeah.
And that tells us that there are other factors at play that can influence how strong that link is between metacognition and math performance.
Okay, so it's more complex than just saying, if you think about thinking, you'll be great at math.
Yeah.
It's not quite that straightforward.
Exactly. It's a bit more nuanced than that.
So what were some of these other factors that they explored?
Well, one of the big ones was how metacognition was actually measured in those different studies.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, how do you actually measure something as internal as thinking about thinking?
Right. So they distinguished between what they called offline measures and online measures.
Offline versus online. What's the
Yeah.
difference?
Okay, so offline measures are typically things like questionnaires or surveys. They basically ask students to reflect on their past learning experiences and how they typically approach things. Like, do you usually try to summarize what you've learned, or do you often check your work? That kind of thing.
So it's like asking them to remember how they've been learning in the past, right?
Exactly. It's their perception of their own habits and skills. Now, online measures are a bit different. They try to capture what's going on in a student's mind while they're actually doing a math task.
So it's like in the moment as they're working through the problem.
Exactly. This could involve things like having students think aloud as they solve a problem,
Yeah.
explaining their reasoning and steps,
Yeah.
or even just observing their behavior as they work. Like, do they seem to be planning their approach or just jumping right in?
Oh, that's interesting. So one is about reflection and the other is about observation in a way.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And they found that these different measurement approaches actually led to different strengths of correlation with math performance.
Really? So how they measured metacognition actually impacted the results?
Yeah, pretty significantly.
Mm.
The meta-analysis showed that the online measures of metacognition had a much stronger connection to math performance than the offline measures.
So actually watching someone solve a problem and seeing their thought process in action tells us more about their math abilities than just asking them how they usually learn.
That's what the data or equal 0.54, while offline measures only had a correlation of R equals 0.3.
Huh. That's almost double. That's a
Yeah.
pretty big difference.
It suggests that what you're thinking about while you're doing math, that active awareness, is really important for success.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I know the study also talked about some debate about how to categorize certain types of measures like confidence judgments and JOLs. Can you explain what those are and why they're a bit tricky?
Sure. So a confidence judgment is basically how sure a student is that they got the answer right. And a JOL, which stands for judgment of learning, is how confident they are that they'll remember the information later.
Okay, so it's like, how sure are you about this?
Exactly. Now, the tricky part is deciding whether those are online or offline measures.
Why is that tricky?
Well, some researchers say they're online because they're directly related to the task the student just completed. They're making a judgment about something they just did or learned. But others argue they're more offline because the judgment is happening after the problem solving or learning is already done, even if it's immediately after.
So it depends on whether you focus on the connection to the specific task or the fact that it's a judgment made after the fact.
Right. And what the meta-analysis found was that even with this debate, measures that were more closely tied to the actual math task tended to have a stronger link with performance. And when they looked at JOLs and confidence judgments separately, they found a correlation of R equals 0.38.
Okay, so stronger than general offline measures, but not as strong as those online in-the-moment measures.
Right. Again, it emphasizes that the link between thinking about thinking and actually doing well in math seems to be strongest when it's all about the task at hand.
That's really fascinating. So we've talked about how metacognition is measured. What about the math itself? Did the study look at whether the difficulty of the math problems mattered?
They did. They made a distinction between simple math tasks, like basic arithmetic, and complex math tasks, which are more challenging and involve multiple steps or concepts.
And I'm going to guess that metacognition is probably more important for those tougher problems.
You guessed right. They found a much stronger relationship between metacognition and performance for the complex math tasks. The correlation was R equals 0.48 for complex tasks versus R equals 0.10 for simple tasks in one analysis.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is. It suggests that when you're dealing with challenging math, really being aware of your thinking, checking your understanding, making adjustments, all those metacognitive skills, they become even more crucial for success.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You probably don't need to overthink adding 2 plus 2, but when you've got a multi-step word problem that's pulling in all sorts of different concepts, that's when you really need to engage those metacognitive muscles.
Exactly. And the study did point out that there weren't a ton of studies that specifically focused on simple math tasks, so we have to take that finding with a grain of salt. But the general trend is clear. Harder math, more need for metacognition.
Okay, so we've talked about how you measure metacognition and the difficulty of the math tasks. Did they look at what happens when you combine those two things?
Oh yeah, they definitely did. And that's where it gets really interesting. They found that the absolute strongest link between metacognition and math performance was when they used online measures of metacognition with complex math tasks.
So those in-the-moment observations of how students think during challenging problems.
That's the one. The correlation in that scenario was R equal 0.54.
That's a pretty strong correlation. And what about the flip side?
Well, the weakest link was when they used offline measures, like those questionnaires, with the simple math tasks. There, the correlation was only R.10.
So the takeaway here is that the combination of those two factors really matters.
Right. If you want to see how strong that connection is between metacognition and math ability, you got to look at both the measurement and the complexity of the math itself.
So what does all this mean, practically speaking? Like, why should teachers and students care about these findings?
Well, I think it has some really important implications for education. For teachers, it highlights the value of teaching metacognitive skills directly, encouraging students to think aloud, to check their work, to plan their approach to a problem. Those things can make a real difference.
And for students, it's like giving them the tools to take control of their own learning, right?
Exactly. They become more aware of what works for them, when they're getting stuck, what strategies they can use to get unstuck.
That's pretty empowering.
Definitely. And the study also mentioned a few things that need more investigation. For example, even after accounting for the measurement type and task complexity, there was still some variability in the results.
So there's more to the story than just those two factors.
Right. They brought up something called JOL reactivity, which is this fascinating idea that making judgments about your learning can actually change what you learn.
Whoa, that's trippy. So, like, the very act of thinking about how well you're understanding something can actually impact your understanding.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. But we don't fully understand how it works yet. And it seems like it can have different effects in different situations. Sometimes it helps learning, sometimes it doesn't make much difference, and sometimes it might even hinder it.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Maybe. It definitely needs more research. They also mentioned the unskilled and unaware phenomenon, which is this tendency for students who aren't performing well to also have a poor understanding of their own limitations.
So they might think they're doing better than they actually are.
Exactly. And that can make it harder to find a clear connection between their self-assessments and their actual performance, especially in situations where guessing is possible.
Yeah, if you don't even realize you're struggling, you're not going to accurately judge your own understanding.
Right. So the researchers emphasize that future studies really need to be careful about how they measure both metacognition and math performance, because the specific measures they use can really influence the results.
Okay, so beyond measurement and task complexity, are there other things going on here that they didn't delve into but could be influencing this relationship?
Absolutely. They briefly mentioned things like math anxiety, which can obviously impact performance. And then there are things like working memory and attention, which are important for both thinking about your thinking and actually doing the math.
So it's this whole web of interconnected factors, with metacognition as a key player, but definitely not the only one.
Exactly. It's a complex picture, which makes it all the more fascinating to study.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. This has been a really in-depth look at metacognition and its role in teenage math performance. So to sum it all up, what's the key takeaway you'd like our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's a strong link between metacognition and math success for teenagers. And that link is strongest when they're actively using those metacognitive skills while tackling challenging problems.
Right. So it's not just about reflecting on your learning style. It's about being present and aware in the moment, especially when the math gets tough.
Precisely.
Awesome. And before we wrap up, do you have a final thought to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder as they go about their day?
I think I'd encourage everyone listening to think about a time when they faced a tough problem. It could be math-related or something completely different. As you were working through it, how aware were you of your own thought process? Did you stop to check your understanding, try different strategies, that sort of thing? Consider how bringing that awareness to the forefront, really tuning into your own thinking, could be the key to not just solving problems, but understanding them on a deeper level.
That's a great point. So it's not just about getting the right answer, it's about understanding how you got there.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding can be applied to any area of life, not just math.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this fascinating deep dive into the world of metacognition. I think we all learned a lot.
My pleasure. It's been a great discussion.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the research that matters.
Until then, keep thinking.
And thinking about your thinking.
Absolutely.